The night stretched endlessly over the desolate highway, swallowing everything in darkness. The only source of light came from the dim glow of the dashboard and the powerful headlights cutting through the pitch-black void. Rebecca Cole drove in silence, the hum of the engine the only sound in the otherwise dead landscape. This was high-risk territory, a stretch of road near the US-Mexico border that had gained a deadly reputation in recent months. Cartel ambushes, disappearances, and blood-soaked crime scenes were common here. Even the most hardened law enforcement agents had learned to fear it. Rebecca wasn't law enforcement. She was something else entirely. The massive ICE, Immigration and Customs Enforcement, truck she drove was no ordinary transport. Its cargo was classified, its mission high stakes. A small detail leaked to the wrong ears, and she could be dead before sunrise. The desert air was thick with unease, the silence stretching too long between the faint chirps of distant wildlife. Something about the atmosphere felt wrong. A lone sign on the roadside flickered as she passed it, riddled with bullet holes, a warning left behind by those who controlled this land. Los Diablos Cartel. Rebecca tightened her grip on the wheel. If they were watching, she'd know soon enough. Rebecca Becky Cole had been through hell before. A former Delta Force operator, she had spent years in the shadows, pulling off missions that never made the news. She was trained for high-risk operations, for survival in enemy territory, for combat when the odds were stacked against her. Now, she was a truck driver. To most, that would seem like an odd career shift. But Rebecca knew better. She was still at war. The battlefield had just changed. Her cover was simple: an independent contractor working government transports. In reality, her cargo was rarely just government property. Tonight was no different. She exhaled slowly, her mind flashing back to a time when missions like this had gone horribly wrong. A dusty Afghan village. An ambush. Her team had been set up, their convoy blown apart before they even knew what hit them. Rebecca had been the last one standing, her rifle the only thing keeping her alive. She could still hear the screams of her fallen brothers in arms. She had sworn never to let something like that happen again. That was why she was here. That was why she had taken this mission. Another quick glance in the mirror. The road was empty, but her instincts screamed at her. She wasn't alone out here. Miles away, deep inside a fortified cartel compound, a meeting was taking place. Javier El Lobo Morales, the brutal leader of Los Diablos, leaned back in his leather chair, a glass of tequila swirling in his hand. He was a man who thrived in chaos, who built his empire on violence, blood, and fear. A lieutenant entered the room, placing a phone on the table. The truck has left the station. It's on the move. El Lobo's sharp eyes flickered with interest. And the driver? Just an ICE transport officer. The lieutenant smirked. Nothing special. Their second mistake. El Lobo tapped his fingers against the glass, considering his next move. This was no ordinary cargo. A human asset was inside. Someone valuable enough to make the US government risk transporting them through cartel territory. He smirked. Send our best. I want that truck. And I want the driver dead. Rebecca wasn't just hauling supplies. Locked in the reinforced containment unit inside the truck was a man who could bring down Los Diablos. Miguel El Sombra Ruiz had once been one of El Lobo's most trusted men. He had overseen drug shipments, human trafficking, and high-profile assassinations. But now, he was something far worse, a traitor. He had cut a deal with the US government. In exchange for testimony and crucial evidence against Los Diablos, he would be granted protection. The kind of protection that only lasted as long as the people protecting him stayed alive. Rebecca didn't trust him. She had seen too many men like him, ruthless, remorseless, and self-serving. But her job wasn't to judge. It was to deliver. As she checked the mirror once more, her heart dropped. Far behind her, 3 sets of headlights appeared over the horizon. They were coming. Rebecca barely flinched as the headlights in her rearview mirror grew closer. 3 blacked-out SUVs. No headlights, no markings, just silent, hungry shadows creeping up behind her. Her grip on the wheel remained steady. Breathe. Stay calm. Assess. She quickly scanned her surroundings. An open stretch of desert highway. No signs of civilization for miles. No way to call for help. Not that she needed any. Help meant complications. Her mind drifted to an old voice from the past. Master Sergeant Boone, her mentor back in Delta Force. Cole, you always expect an ambush. If the road's too quiet, it's because they're waiting. If it looks clear, it's because they want you to think it is. Her pulse remained steady. She had expected this. The cartel had found her. She reached over, subtly adjusting the hidden Glock 19 tucked beneath a worn leather holster on the seat beside her. The weight of it was familiar, grounding. But she didn't go for it. Not yet. She stole a glance at the rearview mirror again. The SUVs weren't rushing her. They were pacing her, tracking her movements. They weren't in a hurry. That meant one thing. They were playing with their food. The SUVs suddenly surged forward. Rebecca's instincts flared. They were testing her, seeing how she'd react. She kept her speed steady. Any sudden movements would confirm that she knew they were tailing her. That would make her prey. "You're the hunter, Cole." Boone's voice again, clear as if he was sitting right next to her. Act like it. Rebecca made a quick tactical assessment. She was outnumbered. They were better armed. They had the home field advantage. She had an 18-wheeler. She tightened her grip on the wheel. Use what you have. Her foot pressed down on the gas. The truck roared forward, engine growling as she pushed it beyond its usual limits. The SUVs kept up. Of course, they did. They were lighter, faster, more maneuverable. But they didn't have her. Rebecca's eyes darted to the GPS on the dashboard. A small, winding back road was coming up ahead, one the cartel wouldn't expect her to take. She waited until the last second, then yanked the wheel hard right. The truck lurched off the highway, tires screaming against the dirt. One of the SUVs reacted too late, shooting past her. The other 2 scrambled to adjust. Rebecca smirked. Now it was a game. Rebecca wasn't stupid. She knew the cartel wouldn't just chase her down. They'd planned for this. That's why, when she spotted something off about the road ahead, she was already slowing down. The dirt path she had taken should have been empty. But up ahead, barely visible in the moonlight, something glinted. Spike strips. Classic move. Disable the vehicle. Force her to stop. It might have worked if she was just another ICE driver. Instead of hitting the brakes, Rebecca did the opposite. She accelerated. The cartel men standing behind the spike strips barely had time to react before her 18-wheeler barreled toward them like an unstoppable battering ram. Rebecca felt the impact before she even saw it. The truck plowed through the barricade, sending men scrambling, vehicles skidding. She heard the sickening crunch of metal and bone as at least one cartel gunman didn't make it out of the way in time. Her side mirror shattered as a lucky bullet found its mark. The cartel wasn't playing anymore. One of the SUVs veered off-road, making a desperate attempt to cut her off. The other stayed behind, peppering the back of her truck with small arms fire. Rebecca gritted her teeth. This was only the beginning. The cartel wasn't giving up. One of the SUVs swerved ahead, forcing Rebecca to slam the brakes. The massive truck skidded to a halt, dust and gravel kicking up in thick clouds. Before the air even cleared, figures emerged from the shadows. 5 gunmen, well-armed, well-trained, and in front of them, standing with a smirk on his scarred face, Javier El Lobo Morales. Rebecca exhaled slowly and reached for her weapon. Not yet. She pushed the door open and stepped out, slow, calculated, unshaken. One of the gunmen whistled. "Brave, aren't you?" El Lobo chuckled. No, she's not brave." He studied her, eyes gleaming with amusement. "She just doesn't know who she's dealing with." Rebecca met his gaze, unreadable. She wasn't scared. She had already won. El Lobo took a slow step forward, his men spreading out, cutting off any escape. "You made quite a mess back there, mujer." Rebecca shrugged. "You blocked my road." El Lobo laughed. "That was a warning. This," he gestured toward his men, all raising their weapons, "is your last chance." Rebecca tilted her head, scanning the terrain, the positioning of every man, every vehicle. She wasn't just standing there. She was calculating. "Always expect an ambush." Boone's voice whispered in her head. A slow smirk tugged at her lips. El Lobo frowned. "Something funny?" Rebecca's fingers flexed at her side, inching closer to her weapon. Then, with quiet confidence, she answered, "Yeah." Then she moved. The cartel men closed in, their weapons raised, their confidence unshaken. To them, Rebecca was just another truck driver, a minor inconvenience, a woman alone against a group of armed men. Easy prey. But as Rebecca exhaled, slowly, deliberately, she did something that shifted the air. She shrugged off her trucker jacket. The dim moonlight caught ink and scars, tattooed coordinates from operations buried in classified files, the unmistakable Delta Force insignia on her shoulder. Faint, healed over wounds from bullet grazes and knife fights long before this night. The cartel men hesitated. Javier Morales, watching closely, narrowed his eyes. Rebecca rolled her shoulders, loosening up. Her voice came out low and even, cutting through the night like a blade. "You boys have no idea what kind of hell you just walked into." Silence. Then, the first mistake. One of the younger cartel members, brash, overeager, snorted and reached for her. Rebecca moved. The first man didn't even see it coming. Rebecca caught his wrist, twisting it at a sickening angle. A sharp crack filled the air. His gun clattered to the ground. Before his scream could leave his throat, she drove a brutal elbow into his jaw. His head snapped back, body crumpling like a puppet with cut strings. 2 more men rushed in. Rebecca was already on them. She ducked under a wild swing, pivoted, launched a palm strike to the first man's throat. He gagged, stumbling back. In one seamless motion, she disarmed the second, flipped his gun, and fired. One shot. Perfect headshot. Controlled breathing. Steady hands. Years of sniper training kicked in like muscle memory. The man with the crushed throat dropped to his knees, gasping. Rebecca finished him off swiftly. Then, gunfire erupted. Javier's men scrambled for cover as Rebecca dived behind her truck. Bullets ripped through metal, puncturing the thick exterior of the semi-trailer. Sparks flew as rounds pinged off steel. Rebecca's mind was already working. Assess. Adapt. Execute. She ejected the spent magazine, smoothly loading another. Her breathing slowed. Flashbacks hit. The scorching deserts of the Middle East. A sniper rifle pressed against her shoulder. Her target in the scope. One shot. One kill. Back in the present. Her eyes locked onto movement. A cartel member peeked out from behind a barrel. She squeezed the trigger. The bullet split the air. The man collapsed. Javier watched as his men fell, one by one. His amusement had turned to rage. "Enough!" he snarled into his radio. Within seconds, reinforcements arrived. But not just any men, his top assassins. Rebecca caught the shift immediately. These weren't just cartel grunts. They moved differently. Disciplined. Precise. Special forces. Mercenaries. Didn't matter. One of them, a mountain of a man wielding a knife, charged at her. Rebecca let him come. At the last second, she sidestepped, deflected the blade, countered with a brutal knee strike, spun behind him, arm wrapped tight around his throat. He struggled, clawing at her grip. Rebecca tightened. Within seconds, his body went limp. She shoved him aside just as another assassin lunged. A blur of steel, she blocked the blade, twisted his wrist, and drove it into his gut. Blood sprayed as he staggered back, eyes wide with shock. Meanwhile, behind her, the cartel made a desperate move. They tried to climb onto her truck, prying at the cargo doors. Rebecca wasn't having it. She vaulted forward, firing as she moved. The first man barely made it up the steps before a bullet punched through his chest. The second, Rebecca caught him by the collar and yanked him down. His head slammed against the pavement, unmoving. The cartel's plan was failing, and Javier knew it. The battlefield fell silent. Javier stood alone now. His last remaining men scattered or dead. Rebecca straightened, rolling her shoulders, her body aching but unshaken. Javier studied her. Then he smirked. "I'll admit it, Gringa. You're impressive." Rebecca didn't respond. He reached into his coat, pulled out a thick wad of cash. "We don't have to do this. Name your price." He held out the money. "Walk away. No one will touch you again." Rebecca's lips barely moved. "I already told you." Javier's smirk faltered. "You have no idea what kind of hell you just walked into." His hand twitched. Rebecca saw it before he moved. He went for his gun. She was faster. Javier barely got his weapon out before she closed the gap. A brutal strike to his wrist. Gun clattered to the ground. He threw a desperate punch. She caught it, twisted his arm, and drove an elbow into his ribs. Javier gasped. Rebecca pivoted, sweeping his legs out from under him. He hit the ground, groaning. He reached for something at his belt. Rebecca stomped down hard on his hand. Not tonight. With one final, precise strike, she ended it. The cartel retreated. Their leader, broken, left behind. Rebecca inhaled deeply, wiping the blood from her hands. The job wasn't over yet. The echoes of battle faded into the night, leaving behind the acrid scent of burnt gunpowder and blood. Rebecca exhaled slowly, shaking off the last remnants of adrenaline. Her body ached, bruises forming beneath her shirt. Her knuckles split from the fight, but she was still standing. She turned toward the truck. The cargo. A low groan came from behind her. The defector. Rebecca strode over, her boots crunching against shattered glass and shell casings. The man, Miguel Gutierrez, was slumped against the wheel well of the trailer, clutching his side where a stray bullet had grazed him. His face was pale, but his eyes were still sharp, still terrified. "You," he gasped. "You saved me." Rebecca, crouched beside him, checking his wound. "Wasn't doing it for you." Her voice was steady, cool. She pulled a strip of cloth from her vest, pressing it against his injury. "But you're still breathing. That's more than I can say for your old friends." Miguel shuddered. He knew. Rebecca stood, glancing toward the truck. The massive 18-wheeler bore the scars of the firefight. Bullet holes riddled the sides. The mirrors were shattered, and the front grille was peppered with debris. But the engine was intact. It would get her home. She gave the truck a firm pat. "Come on, old girl. We're not done yet." With one final look around the battlefield, she turned back to Miguel. "You coming or not?" As Rebecca climbed into the driver's seat, she caught movement in the distance. Javier Morales, the once feared cartel lieutenant, was now on his knees, bloodied, his face twisted in fury and humiliation. Rebecca could have ended him. She had every reason to. But instead, she swung the truck door open and stepped down, walking toward him with slow, deliberate steps. Javier glared up at her, breathing raggedly. She knelt in front of him, just close enough for him to see the cold certainty in her eyes. "You're going to live." He blinked, stunned. "And you're going to carry a message." Javier's jaw clenched. He hated this, hated the power shift. Rebecca leaned in slightly. "Tell your men, if they ever come for me again, they won't get the chance to run." Javier didn't speak, but the fear in his eyes was answer enough. Rebecca straightened, turned, and walked away. Behind her, Javier watched in silence as the truck's engine roared to life. The woman he had underestimated, the woman who had torn through his entire operation like a ghost from hell. As she drove off into the night, he realized one thing. He had made a very, very dangerous enemy. Rebecca's grip on the wheel was steady, her eyes focused on the dark road ahead. The wind howled outside, the stars stretching endlessly above the deserted highway. She was alone again, just like before. Her thoughts drifted, not to the men she had killed, but to the ones she hadn't, to the lives she had spared, to Javier. Had she done the right thing? Would he come back? Would he seek revenge? The memories surfaced. The jungles of South America, the sandstorms of the Middle East, the freezing mountains where she had spent nights in sniper positions, waiting for a target that never knew she was there. A soldier's work was never done. Her radio crackled. She reached for it, static filling the cab before a voice came through. Familiar, sharp. Mission accomplished, but it won't be your last. Rebecca exhaled, a ghost of a smile on her lips. Yeah, I figured. The road stretched ahead, endless, and Rebecca kept driving, into whatever came next. The safe house was cold, sterile. White walls, steel doors, security cameras in every corner. Miguel Gutierrez sat in a dimly lit room, hands wrapped around a cup of coffee, eyes hollow. He was alive, but he knew his war wasn't over. Outside, a team of federal agents monitored him. His testimony would cripple Los Diablos. But the cartel? They weren't finished yet. Hundreds of miles away, in a lavish mansion hidden deep in the hills, Javier Morales nursed his wounds. A cartel doctor stitched his side, his men whispering nervously around him. Javier stared at the floor, silent. The humiliation burned hotter than the pain. That woman, one of his lieutenants muttered. She's not normal. Javier slammed his fist on the table. I know who she is now. His voice was ice. Rebecca Cole. Delta Force. Ghost Unit. The room went still. Every man there understood what that meant. Javier leaned forward, eyes dark with vengeance. Find her. We're not done. Rebecca drove down an endless stretch of highway, the night pressing in around her. Her world had always been this: motion, silence, the unknown. She should have felt relief. The mission was done, the cargo delivered, the fight over. But it wasn't. Not really. Her phone rang. A blocked number. She hesitated, then answered. A deep, measured voice came through. You rattled the wrong cage, Cole. A beat of silence. Then a click. The line went dead. Rebecca stared at the phone, expression unreadable. Then, slowly, she placed it down and tightened her grip on the wheel. She had been in this game too long to think it was over. The road ahead stretched into the darkness. She knew one thing for sure. Some fights, you don't get to walk away from. She pressed her foot to the gas, her voice a whisper in the wind. And some people, you never should have messed with.